John Glover is not the first Australian artist you would think of when thinking about Greek and Roman mythology and their reception in Australian art. But there's one painting where he does make the choice to use a Greek and Roman myth, the myth of Actaeon, in his famous painting, The Bath of Diana. We're here in Evandale, standing by John Glover's statue, but the scene of that painting was not near his property close to here, but at his original property in the south of Tasmania when he was staying near Tea Tree in Brighton. Finding the location of the painting now is difficult. This is a landscape which had recently been disrupted and redistributed, even when Glover was painting. According to the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, the painting shows a combined Oyster Bay and Big River group, who were also painted by Glover in Aborigines Dancing at Brighton and The Last Muster of the Tasmanian Aborigines at Risdon. It's now divided even more by roads, fences, all of the signs of owned land rather than country in the Aboriginal sense. After some searching in the area of Tea Tree, Pontville and Brighton, we're somewhere near where John Glover painted the Bath of Diana nearly 200 years ago now. It's one of Glover's paintings where he's looking back to, as he imagined, the life of the Palawa people before the coming of Europeans. And it's a period which he imagines as a kind of golden age. So the thing about golden ages is that there's only one story about them, which is that they come to an end. And this is really what Glover is doing in part with Greek mythology in this painting. He's showing a golden age and showing that it is indeed coming to an end. This is part of his own implicatedness as a person who is a direct beneficiary of the dispossession of the people whom he's painting. It's considerably drier here now, that a lot of the water's probably been diverted away from what was once the Bath of Diana. But the rock formations along here look fairly similar, really all along this stretch of river, to the kind of thing that Glover was depicting. Still lots of eucalypts with that characteristic shape that he was trying to capture, something that at that stage was very new to European art, and certainly very new to Glover's art as well. We have, in another way, followed Glover's movement through Tasmania, starting from the south and the region around Hobart and moving to the north. The house in which we're staying, Freshwater Point Homestead, was built in 1824, a little before Glover's Bath of Diana. During his period of travelling in and painting northern Tasmania, it would have been one of the few substantial houses in its area. It's possible that Glover may have visited there, though we've not yet found anything to verify it. The classical world had previously appeared in Glover's paintings. Generally what these depict are idyllic rural landscapes with ruins crumbling elegantly in the background. It's not, in other words, a real engagement with the narratives of the ancient world. It's more the ancient world as an idea, as a continued presence in the landscape, which is important in those types of Glover painting. But the Bath of Diana is something really quite different. So what then is the myth of Actaeon? This is famously told in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Actaeon is a hunter. He comes upon the goddess Diana, or Artemis in her Greek name, who's bathing with her nymphs. Now, there's some variation here as to whether he's deliberately spying on the goddess or whether it's an accidental fault. Certainly Ovid is very emphatic that he is an accidental victim, that he merely sees the goddess by accident. But the way that Ovid protests about it certainly suggests that he knows other versions where Actaeon is in fact guilty. So he's reminding us, in effect, of those versions of the story, even as he denies it. In other words, the myth of Actaeon is always a myth about seeing what we're not supposed to see. So what Glover has done in The Bath of Diana is take this story and to transpose it into a story depicting Palawa people in Van Diemen's Land. That in itself is really quite an interesting move and would certainly make the painting worth our looking at. But there are further ambiguities in this as well. A lot of the other paintings which Glover made of Palawa people show a kind of idyll and a kind of golden age. It's an age of innocence in their depiction. Even though he had in fact sketched Aboriginal people in prisons, he never depicts them in that kind of environment. He doesn't depict the great trouble which had gone on between settlers and Palawa people, the great persecutions, the massacres which had happened in very recent times. These are very fresh and very painful memories in the Van Diemen's Land of his day. So we see in all of these Aboriginal paintings of Glover a depiction of an idyllic existence, a golden age existence. And in this painting we see this as well, but we also see a touch of aggression from the Actaeon figure in the left who's brandishing a spear. And if we're aware of the story, we're looking at the moment before his transformation and his violent end. The dogs of Actaeon are visible, and it's these dogs which in the traditional story are going to be the means of his death. He's torn apart, in fact, by his own pack of hunting dogs. So we're looking at a moment perhaps before some sort of loss of innocence. That's one of the ways we can look at it. Perhaps we're looking at the end of this Golden Age idyll as well, if we want to extrapolate from there. As well as working in the tradition of the story, Glover must also have been very aware that he was working in the tradition of painting. There have been visual representations of the myth of Diana and Actaeon going right back into antiquity. There are sculpture groups of which we know from descriptions. There are visual accounts which survive as well. And we also have more recent paintings too. So he must have been aware that there's a very long tradition here in which he's working. In those, we often have the goddess towering over her nymphs in paintings like this. She's often shown in some way to be of a very different status to the mortal figure, who's also at the centre of this story. And that's exactly what Glover has not done. His Diana is stretched out in the centre of the painting. She's swimming in the pool, and it seems swimming towards the Actaeon figure who's standing on the opposite bank. That in itself is really quite different. And one of the things that occurs to me here is that this can be related to the other mythic strand going on here to do with the Golden Age. That we're looking at an age where there's less of a divide between humanity and divinity, that humans are somehow more dignified, that they are closer to a divine status in themselves, and the gods are consequently closer to our status because of that elevation of the human. That in itself is very interesting in terms of his treatment of the Palawa people whom he saw around him and some of whom he knew. The elevation of the human in Glover's painting, then, is in a way an extension of the anthropomorphism which he's getting from the Greek and Roman mythological tradition. The idea that the gods are rather like human beings is one which is, of course, intrinsic to all of Greek and Roman mythology. But bringing that a bit further, he's bringing the gods and the human figures, I think, very close in a painting like this, much more so than tends to be the case in this theme, which is, after all, really very much about the power of the gods and their arbitrary ability to affect the lives of human beings. The other thing which images of Diana or Artemis and Actaeon tend to do is to implicate their viewers. We too are watching this scene. We too, like Actaeon, may be looking at something that we're not really supposed to be looking at. Does the painting, in other words, suggest that we as settler viewers are Actaeons too, that we're watching what we shouldn't, that there's a kind of prurient fascination in spying on these Aboriginal people doing their traditional way of life? It wouldn't be the first painting on this theme to do so, and Glover must have known that. He must have been well aware that paintings of Actaeon and sculptures of Actaeon have been doing this for many centuries. But doing it in this new colonial context does add something quite different to it. Whatever we make of this position, this Actaeon position that we as viewers are obliged to take by the painting, it's also worth noting that this position, this watcher position outside of the action and really quite remote from the figures in the painting, is where Glover generally places us in his depictions of Aboriginal people, not only in the Bath of Diana, but in his other, and in some respects perhaps more famous paintings of Aboriginal people and their way of life. It's never an up-close view when Glover is looking at the Palawa people around him. The Bath of Diana is a great example of the way that identifying a myth is only ever a first step in interpreting a piece of mythological art. To say this is the myth of Actaeon is very interesting, and that's a good starting point, but it doesn't actually tell us what's going on. And it's when we start trying to align the myth with the painting that things really begin to get interesting, and I think in this painting really quite ambiguous. In this image, it may well be that a large part of its point and its effect is that we cannot be certain how the interplay of myths comes to rest. There's a tension between this golden age, this idealisation, and the really very violent myth of Actaeon. Combining these two is quite strange. They both do exist in Ovid's Metamorphoses, but there are very different layers of mythic time. So bringing them together in a single image is in itself quite a strange move, and one which we're obliged to interpret. We cannot but try to make some sense of that. The difficulty which the painting gives us in making any kind of ultimate sense of it is, I think, really part of what this painting is all about. So the ambiguities and tensions in the myth and in their depiction within this new colonial setting are certainly not accidental. Glover himself is at once fascinated by Palawa people, he's sympathetic towards them, even idealising of them, and yet he's himself a settler and he's a beneficiary of their dispossession and the violence that's been done to them.